Okay, everyone. So we are now live on Facebook. Welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening. And thank you to everyone that's joining me today that's given up their time to participate in this virtual event for the Nightline 50 campaign. So my name is Katie, and I, along with Sarah, who's managing the questions behind the scenes this evening and has coordinated getting everyone here today. We're both volunteers with the Nightline Association, and we're tasked back in early 2019 with coordinating the Nightline 50 campaign, which is designed to mark 50 years of the Nightline movement. We're not alone in our roles, and we're supported by numerous of other fantastic Nightline Association volunteers who have been absolutely invaluable in bringing together this campaign. As you might imagine, we had grand visions of how we might mark the 50th anniversary of the Nightline movement. And I can honestly say that despite knowing how unpredictable charity work can be, when we began developing these plans in February 2019, we certainly did not anticipate being confronted with a pandemic that would result in serious changes to what we ended up delivering. However, resourcefulness is a quality shared by many in the charity sector. And this crisis has really demonstrated our capacity as volunteers to adapt to difficult situations and produce brilliant things in a short space of time with very little resource other than our own ingenuity and some very helpful technology. These qualities are ones that are shared by those responsible for founding the Nightline movement. And we are very privileged to have some of these people here with us today. So joining us on the call are Marilyn Griffin. Marilyn, do you want to give us a wave? Excellent, thanks, Marilyn. So Marilyn is a University of Essex alumna and one of the first students involved in Nightline. We also have Professor Geoffrey Hosking. Can you give us a wave too? Excellent, thank you. So Geoffrey was a lecturer and local Samaritans volunteer at the time and instrumental in setting up Nightline at Essex back in 1970. And as you can see sitting next to Geoffrey, we have Anne Hosking, who is also a University of Essex alumna and was an early Essex Nightline volunteer. Now, to complement having the founders of Essex Nightline, we're also joined by the current director of Essex Nightline, the coordinator. And thank you, I think Eassa has just waved there, great. And along with having such a long-standing Nightline here with us today, we have the coordinators from Stirling Nightline, Jen Littlejohn, Iona and Ellie McManemy, who started Nightline just this year in January 2020. So we have a beautiful sort of a mirror or a complement of Nightlines here with us, both from the longest standing Nightline in the UK to one of the newest. And hopefully this is going to give us some great opportunity to learn about how Nightline has evolved over the years. I'd like us to start by talking about the founding story. And I'm going to go to Marilyn first of all. And some of you who follow Nightline on Facebook and our other social media platforms might have seen that we've shared a little audio story that Marilyn put together, talking about how Nightline came about from her perspective as a student at the time. Marilyn, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what happened in those original conversations that you were part of that started Nightline.
Okay. Well, at that time, Essex University, there was quite a lot of student unrest and student revolt. We're talking, Geoffrey maybe remembers quite well, there was people distrusted authority, even so it had to be something that came from the students. And Essex University at the time was still building. I mean, it was only 2,000 students, I think, when I was there. And every year there were more students. It was a construction site as well. The architecture I found pretty intimidating. It was rather, I don't know if you remember, but those tall tower blocks, were 14 stories, dark concrete. There were no flowers around. I mean, we were sitting in the middle of a park and there was a lovely lake and the university library was great. But if you were at night in one of these tower blocks with the east wind whistling around, Essex was pretty cold in the wintertime. It was lovely as a campus in the spring and the summer, but most of the students had left by then. I mean, the summer was probably quite lovely, but we were there in October, November, December, these cold, cold times. And, you know, it was bleak. So at night, when everything shut down, there were a lot of students on the campus, cut off from anywhere. It was you couldn't really walk anywhere, particularly at night anyway, but there was nothing. And students don't go to sleep at 11 o'clock at night. Not from my experience anyway. So we were talking, we heard an ambulance, I think it was an ambulance bell in those days, you know, came ringing, and we thought, oh, and then immediately the police would come. Colchester is also a garrison town. So, you know, where there were students or soldiers, the police were, you know, the police were aware that there might be drugs, you know, and they always sort of followed in immediately. So generally, if there was anybody had any problems, well, they needed to get in contact with anybody else apart from the security guards, there was nothing. It was closed. You know, the site offices, everything was closed. So we started talking when we heard this bell. At the foot of the towers, you could see quite a lot of remains of cigarettes, not always legal cigarettes. So there was quite a bit of drug taking at that time in Essex. Not everybody, obviously, but I met people who'd had bad trips and were going back into bad trips with LSD. And also all kinds of people sometimes came to stay because there was no control over who was actually staying there in the evenings, particularly with a student unrest. You know, there were all kinds of people around. So anyway, we got talking, we heard the bell, you know, the alarm, the sirens, and we thought, who can people go to if they have a problem late at night? There is nothing. It was a wilderness. So Maggie, who probably Anne and Geoffrey remember, I was sharing a flat with Maggie because we were doing the same courses, and she needed somebody, you know, we really needed to get around. She had a wheelchair, one of these old style push wheelchairs. And so we were doing the same course, and so it was our second year. Maggie was always on campus. She didn't. She stayed on campus all her 4 years at Essex. And that year I was sharing with Maggie, and we would go around, did a bit of guerrilla gardening, tried to plant something up, you know, to make it look a little bit friendlier. Anything we could to try and make it a bit more human. And this was one of the things that came up when we were discussing that night, that there needed to be some student-to-student contact. Okay.
Yeah. Right? No, thank you. That really captures sort of some of the really crucial elements that I think have lasted throughout the Nightline movement, and that sort of the harnessing of what was needed at the time has clearly sustained in the fact that Nightline still exists 50 years on. Geoffrey, I wanted to ask you, from your perspective, what your sort of thoughts were when the students first brought this idea to you, when you were first brought into this conversation about needing something like Nightline at Essex.
Yes, well, I remember Maggie very well, and she found that, quite apart from all the things Marilyn mentioned, that students picked on her particularly to pour out their problems to, partly because she was immobile, well, not quite immobile, but it was difficult for her to get around, and she was always in her flat, and so they might go to her at any hour of the day or night. And she was very willing to listen to people, but she thought that it would be better if the burden was shared around a bit. So she went to see the Anglican chaplain, Malcolm France, and he thought this was a good idea, and he called in me and one other Colchester Samaritan, and then Nigel Collingwood, who was the Catholic chaplain. And we discussed it and decided it would make sense to try and set up a Samaritan type organisation, though run by the students themselves, in order that students who were unhappy, especially in the middle of the night, could have someone they could phone, or indeed go up to the centre. The university, you won't be surprised here, was not particularly keen on this. In fact, one or two of the professors were very much opposed. they said, you know, if students were suffering from serious problems, then they should go to a professional and have the thing properly dealt with. Well, we answered to that. Secondly, we answered, firstly, that professionals don't operate in the middle of that, and someone who's very unhappy wants to talk straight away about it. Secondly, that they would often rather talk to their own kind rather than to a professional, someone like themselves. And thirdly, that we would train the nightliners well enough that they would be able to spot if there was a serious mental illness or a serious social problem which needed intervention from outside. And then we would try and make sure that that happened with the permission, of course, of the caller, because everything was confidential. So that's how it started. I had some doubts about it at the time. I thought that, you know, Samaritans was a good thing, but it would be difficult to introduce this in a campus of fewer than 2,000 people, which it was at the time. I thought anonymity and confidentiality would be impossible to sustain. And I thought the whole thing would probably fizzle out after about 6 weeks. You know, we'd have 2 or 3 hoax calls and that was all. But I was quite wrong, as you can see. And in fact, it did work. It was a bit of a slow start, but we got regular callers every night. Something happened in the first term. So there we are. And not only did it survive 6 weeks, it survived 50 years.
Yes, it's brilliant. Thank you very much for sharing that. I wanted to go to Stirling now, maybe starting with Iona, whether that story of how Nightline started sort of shares any parallels with your experience of setting up a Nightline for the first time at your university.
Yeah, absolutely. Like Marilyn said, we really wanted to create a service that people could go to with a student-on-student contact. And like Geoffrey said as well, providing students with, like for students themselves, help so that somebody can speak to someone who feels like their own kind, someone who is going to understand their problems. And we really found that at Stirling that the student community really did want to help. Me and Jen were amazed at the amount of people that wanted to help when we said that we were going to recruit volunteers, and we had an amazing amount of people who wanted to volunteer with us, whether that was being a listener volunteer or a publicity volunteer, or people just emailing to say they wanted to help in any way that they could. So hopefully with that enthusiasm in 50 years time, maybe we can also say that we've lasted that long. That'd be amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. Jen, sorry, I wanted to pick up on, so Geoffrey mentioned about thinking about the concern around confidentiality and anonymity, and these are some of the core principles that Nightlines operate on to this day. Did you also have conversations about that when you were starting at Stirling?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And in the way that Geoffrey was saying about the sort of pushback and the concerns from professors and other people who worked as part of the university staff, confidentiality and privacy are obviously two massive issues and important issues, and it's important that people should feel comfortable to speak out, knowing that those feelings are held privately and that they're respected and their wishes to remain anonymous and private are respected. But yeah, there was deep concerns about that, and also we are a small campus and we're not quite as small as 2,000 students, but we are campus based, so everyone's all, you know, if not in actually on the campus, we're all in the city centre. So yeah, it's an absolute it's a must, and that's something that we worked really hard at with the policies and procedures surrounding confidentiality and privacy, just to make sure that everyone felt safe and comfortable with us setting up a Nightline, and it worked out really well, and we've had no issues so far from that. And I think we've definitely reassured our faculty staff that Nightline is something that's safe and it's something that's needed as well.
Absolutely. So just picking up on the enthusiasm from the student population in terms of wanting to offer their time to volunteer, I wanted to first go to Anne Hosking. You were one of the first recruited volunteers at Essex Nightline. Can you tell us a bit about what made you want to get involved? You know, how did you hear about it? What was your motivation?
Nightline started in the spring term of my 3rd year. And I knew some of my friends were getting interested in something. This was towards the end of the spring term. And they were saying, come along, Anne, this is fun. It's going to be interesting. I kind of knew about it, but so at the beginning of the summer term, I went along. I'd missed part of the training, but I did actually meet Geoffrey Hosking, so that was very good. And I was impressed with the training. I joined. I did a few duties, had one caller in the whole of that summer term, and then graduated and went. But I've never forgotten it because I learnt so much. And I think I've been putting what I learnt into practice in the last 50 years. I can definitely think of things in my working career where the credit goes to Nightline.
Yeah, that's something I'll come back to again later as well, because the sort of transferable skills is such a valuable part of what we get as volunteers, as well as obviously it being such an important service. Ellie, you are soon to be sort of succeeding Jen as the internal coordinator at Stirling Nightline. So you're someone who's come in slightly more recently than they were in terms of the setting up process. How does Anne's story relate to yours? Like, I assume it's much different now how Nightlines recruit their volunteers, and I know it varies across different universities. What can you share with us? Oh, I think you're on mute. There we go.
So when Jen and Iona had first gone to start it and advertise wanting volunteers, I was really eager. I really wanted to get involved. And I guess much like Anne said, even though I've only been involved for a short amount of time, I know that I've learned things that are going to be very important for the rest of my life. It's impeccable how much of a difference it can make, and I just wanted to be part of that. So the training was amazing. Even if I wasn't part of the service, I'd recommend anybody had training of a similar nature. And it just gives you the skills to communicate with people in such a empathetic, positive way. And I think everybody should be able to do that. And it's really important for people to have that and know that they can talk in a safe environment and not be judged.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. I'm going to go back a little bit to something that was mentioned earlier on in terms of the sometimes not necessarily criticism, but reticence from others amongst the university community. And obviously also there's been a lot of support throughout the movement. There was support from staff setting up Nightline back in 1970. I'm going to go to Eassa now and ask how that relationship at Essex is used today, like how important that dynamic is to the sustainability of your Nightline service.
So at the moment, the Essex University and Essex Nightline have a great relationship. I've got several points of contact and several members of staff that I can actually go to if I need help. Someone called Samantha Hanley is actually my main point of contact. We're always emailing, speaking back and forth. We regularly update the university what happens with Nightline, and then the university kind of mirror that support. If I need something, for example, if something's happened in the flat and I need something cleaned, I can like email the estate services and they'd come. So we kind of feel like, even though we are a standalone service, we kind of feel like an extension of the university. And so that connection is really great and important. I think it's really important that we've never had to worry about finances or resources, because it kind of relieves that stress from us. And I think we can focus on how we can provide the best service possible for students. And yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's that support that's so crucial, and it sounds to me like the way in which you're embedded in the structure of the university is also something that makes it much more possible to sustain a service. And I imagine, Stirling, I'll go back to you, Iona. Does that sort of echo some of your experience in terms of trying to get your service recognised by the university, I suppose?
Yeah, absolutely. When we were as we were about to launch, both the university and our students' union was fundamental in helping us to do that, particularly Audrey, who's CEO of the Students' Union at Stirling. She was absolutely amazing and sounds similar in that she was a member of staff who we could go to, who was 100% on board and there to support us. We were also really fortunate because our university communications team got involved in creating a publicity video for us just before we launched, and they publicised that on all of their social media platforms to reach students who we otherwise wouldn't have been able to reach. Yeah, they've been amazing.
Great. Hearing those stories, Marilyn, I wondered if you could comment on sort of your experience, sort of the importance of Nightline's role within the university sector. Seeing how it gets supported is obviously one element, but do you think it has sort of wider importance?
Okay, I think because it comes from the students, it becomes so much more relevant to the students. I just think, but also the original association with the Samaritans gave it a credibility. We often don't understand the background of a lot of students. When they come to university, they've all had emotional experiences in their lives, which don't always play out very easily in a university setting. You know, they will have had family history of maybe suicide. They will have had family history of mental problems, you know, family who are drinking, you know, parents who are drinking too much. There are all kinds of things that you never know is in a student's experience. And I think this is not particularly recognised by the universities. I think it's rather overlooked. It can be, you know, they're there to study, is sort of the idea. But people come with an emotional baggage, and that has to be recognised. And maybe, you know, other students recognise that because they have at their, you know, every student is a student of their time, and every student has a different emotional background. You know, our emotional background was parents who'd gone through the Second World War, and then, you know, there was suddenly this huge explosion in the 1960s, you know, of teenage rebellion, if you like. It was a big change in society, but of course every student goes through their own lifestyle changes. Nothing stays the same. So for it to be students to students who understand where they're coming from, you know, our time is history. My time is history, if you like. But, you know, everything goes on, and people always have emotional problems. Doesn't matter over the years where those problems, you know, they're the same problems.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Going back to the comments that have been made about how important the skills Nightline volunteers have developed over the years, one of the sessions that we ran at our recent spring conference was called Life Post Breakup with Your Nightline. And it was aimed at getting our volunteers to think about how their Nightline experience could benefit them in their future careers. And obviously that's usually the bottom of the list when you first think, I want to volunteer for Nightline. You go in thinking, I want to contribute something, and then just by beautiful accident, you come out with so many valuable experiences, but it can be quite difficult to sort of think about harnessing that into translating them into your career. And I know, Anne Hosking, you have commented previously on the transferable skills of Nightline volunteers, and you mentioned it just briefly before. Can you tell us a bit more about this and how important these experiences have been for you?
When I went to Essex, I went for the sailing. I intended to have a career back in South America, where I'd come from. I was going to be an entrepreneur, setting up my own language school. But in fact, what I actually did after family life, because I hadn't even envisaged having children, but then we did. the work that I ended up doing was at the central offices of the Quakers, and it was very much involved in pastoral care throughout. I started off with children's work, being very interested in the development of children. Developed into, by the late 80s, I was very concerned with safeguarding, which was quite early on for a lot of organisations. Did a course on child abuse. Sorry, on coping with child abuse, not on abusing, get it right. And that grew so that later on I served the committee which was keen on equal marriage. What did I learn from Nightline? Interestingly enough, the difference between confidentiality and autonomy. If you're in a small community, you meet people, but you don't say, how was it after last Monday? You don't ask. If they want to speak to you, that's their choice, but you don't impinge on their privacy. I forget what I was told in confidence. I mean, seriously, I do forget. Trained myself to forget. That was very important in my work in pastoral care when I would get phone calls from people about their private lives. Very often when I went to visit a Quaker congregation or a church or on retreat, people would want to talk to you. Secondly, being trustworthy. That comes from people seeing that you can keep a confidence, but also the fact that when they talk to you, you don't look shocked. You don't get all inquisitive about their interesting story that they're telling you. You're a listener and you're totally open to them and full of respect and equality. But I also got the sense just in that one term with Nightline of a community, a team. I don't know if you have spotted this in the last century, but the emphasis on autonomy and individuality and having your own choice. But actually, for me, it was the teamwork. You didn't do Nightline on your own. You were always with a partner, whoever it might be. You had somebody you could go to. Your training was communal. You shared the principles. So for me, the sense of community has continued in my work, and to the extent that in most recent years I've had a lot to do with funerals, end of life matters, and for that, the openness, the truthfulness of being with people when their lives no longer have room for any pretense, that's been very important, and that's come out. I can trace it right back 50 years to Nightline. Ever so grateful for that. Couldn't have done it without.
Thank you. That's some very moving words to hear, actually. And I really appreciate all of that. Thank you. Going to the more present day now, Eassa, I wondered if you could talk a bit more about, because you've been a Nightline volunteer at Essex for now 3 years. Can you tell me maybe what most important thing you've taken from your time as a volunteer?
Well, yeah, this has really been the highlight of my university experience. I've learned a lot, and I've learned a lot about people, and more specifically people's emotions. And this may sound really cliche, but everyone deals with things differently, and everyone needs to take a different approach into their problems. And so I think it's emotional intelligence is something that I've definitely exclusively picked up from Nightline. I think emotional intelligence is a soft skill that a lot of employers are actually looking for, and at university I don't think there's a lot of opportunities where you can actually develop and practice that skill. So I think Nightline's really been, yeah, in that respect, yeah, a really good experience.
So valuable. I'll go to Jen with Stirling as well. I know Stirling has not been established for as long, and so your active volunteering experience will have been different, but you've obviously had the experience of setting up a service, which is unusual, I think, for a lot of volunteers across the country, because many have started at various points in the last 50 years. What from that experience do you think you've taken as being something really useful to you?
Oh, I think it's got to be the teamwork. I think what Anne was saying is it's fundamental. You don't, like, Rome wasn't built in a day, and Rome wasn't built by certainly one person. It was definitely a community effort. Sure, it was started by myself and Iona, but then you've also got Audrey, our CEO of the Shinshun Unit, like Iona was saying. We've got volunteers like Ellie, who went above and beyond in terms of just showing their enthusiasm for it and just saying, yeah, we'll take on this. We'll go for training. We'll give up 9 hours of our night a couple times a semester to go and listen to anyone who needs to talk or to vent. Like, that's amazing. Like, that kind of teamwork and that kind of ability to create community is fantastic, where one didn't previously exist. It's amazing. And then we're also neglecting to mention all of the other people who even just help with the technical problems, because I mean, that's just not my thing, but obviously we've got the people who helped us get the telephone started and who gave us a space to run out from our office, and to have those people skills and to say, hey, I'd like to do something that would benefit the students that we're all there to look after and that we're all there to support. Having that kind of common thread is just, yeah, it's fantastic. And it's something that you can implement almost anywhere, as long as there's other people, and as long as you've got that want to care and encourage other people to keep on going and to do things together, then you can apply that knowledge anywhere.
That's great. Yeah, it's I definitely agree with everything that everybody has said. Having been a former Nightline volunteer myself as well, it's something that has tied through into everything else that I've done in my life. It's almost inescapable. So even though we called this session life post breakup with your Nightline, it's almost like you can't ever really break up with Nightline once you've been part of it. Just before we go on to the last section of our conversation, I'd like to remind everyone who's watching, you can get in touch in all the various social media ways if you want to ask a question. The last part of the session after this bit, I'll be fielding a few questions that have been fed to me from our technical support volunteers about anything you want to know about Nightline over the last 50 years, or indeed the future, which brings us on to the sort of this last area of the conversation that I'd like us to focus on, which is thinking about how far this movement has come in the last 50 years and how we can keep sustaining it. I'd like to start with Geoffrey, actually. In our pre-chat before we went live, we were talking about how, where the Nightline in Essex is operating from has changed over the years. Now, obviously, there's a degree of confidentiality around that, but thinking about where you started, can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, well, the university did eventually assign us this derelict hut on the perimeter of the campus, and there we started. But I think the university fairly soon found out that this was a very useful institution. I mean, to put it at its most basic level, the night security staff who were responsible for patrolling the grounds at night, when they came across a drunken or very obviously disturbed student, they now had somewhere that they could send him or her. And that was great. And then I think the university discovered many of the things we've just been talking about, that when students sent in their applications for jobs and things like that, their CV, then volunteering for Nightline looked jolly good, because it meant that you were likely to have the skills of listening attentively and sympathetically to somebody, which is jolly useful skill in professional life and also in family life. And then also, I think Essex found in particular that they could be proud of this organisation, which they had set up with such misgivings, and they've been using it now in their publicity for many years. So it certainly has ended up in a place which I didn't have the remotest vision of when we started out. And because students are going through such a difficult time, many of them, we tend to underestimate this. I mean, it's their first time, often the first time away from home, having to study what is probably quite a difficult course. The exam results are going to be decisive for your life. So you've got to master that. You've got to deal with your first serious relationships as an adult or semi-adult, boyfriend, girlfriend, or boyfriend, boyfriend problems, girlfriend, girlfriend, and so on. All these things are fairly new, and dealing with them all at one time without obvious sources of support means that the student community, mutual aid, and so on become hugely important. And I think the university has learnt this, and I think other universities have as well. And I'd like to hear more about this from others now.
Yes, thank you. If we jump then to today at Essex Nightline, Eassa, could you tell us a bit about how things are obviously now very different? So,
yeah, about how we run the service, or
yeah, it's just sort of generally, like obviously back in 1970, we just had they just had a phone to answer, or maybe people would drop by. How are things working for you in Essex today?
In terms of moving with the how technology has changed, we've got an email service. So there's 3 points of contact that students can contact us. So we've got our phone line, we've got an email, and we've got a drop-in service that students can come into the flat, and which our main service is obviously emotional support, and come in and have a chat. They can also come in just to have some tea and toast and just have a friendly chat, play some games. We've got some board games in the flat. We've also got a lot of things in the flat that we give out for free. Pregnancy tests, condoms, earplugs. So got emergency accommodation. So people can come and stay. We've got, I think at the moment we have 6 beds in the flat that people can come and stay in overnight. This is really important, a really important service at the start of the year, because I think it was last year there was a bit of an accommodation problem where a lot of students came and they didn't have any accommodation. I think luckily some students were reallocated, but there were a few students that didn't have anywhere to go, and there was Nightline obviously, and the university were able to redirect students to Nightline and say you can stay here for one night and until you can find somewhere. A normal shift runs from 10 p.m. to 8 a.m., which I think is the same as it started off. Yeah. We have 1 duty leader and 3 volunteers, and 1 on call. So that's 5 people responsible for the service at a time. I think that's pretty much we still are very much run by students for students. That I always say that anytime I'm giving a talk in front of some students, if I'm at the Freshers' Fair, any sort of stalls, if anyone asks me what is Nightline, I always start with we're a sort of support service run by students for students, and I think that's a really important part of Nightline that we've continued on with.
Yeah, it's amazing to hear the sort of resources that you have on offer to your students in Essex. And I know across the country, Nightlines vary in their offering of ways in which students can get in touch and receive support, and it will depend on what is available at the university and what support for those resources there are. And some of the resources are supported by the Nightline Association as well. So the Nightline Association provides support for instant messaging, which is another way that Nightline volunteers can use to communicate with people as well. I wondered if Ellie at Stirling Nightline, so you're coming into the role of coordinating the service, obviously at quite a strange time where universities have closed earlier than they would have expected. People who were finishing their degrees aren't having the end of university experience that they were expecting. how do you see this impacting your service at Stirling, and what are you thinking for the future of Stirling Nightline?
I think, first of all, it's really important for the students to know that we are still working on making the service as amazing as we can. We really want to get an IM service going as soon as possible so that we can have students still messaging, even if that's remotely. We want to make sure that we are signposting students to other services at the moment if they can't talk to us. We want everyone to stay safe, but we really just want as well to like make sure that as soon as we can be up and functioning as normal, we are doing that, and we're getting the word out, and we are being as public about it as we possibly can, so that everybody knows, especially the people that will be coming to the university in September, know that this service exists and that they can use it when they need it. Because it's like, I think Marilyn said, students don't go to sleep at 11. They get sad after that time. They need somebody to talk to, we're there to listen.
Yeah, thank you. That's brilliant. Marilyn, I just wanted to go back to you briefly. So you're joining us today from Greece, from Athens. Thank you. I don't think there's too much of a time difference, so it's not too weird for you.
So just 2 hours later.
Yes. But going abroad obviously will have had an impact on your connection to Nightline over the years. And in doing this campaign around Nightline 50, we've managed to re-establish this connection with you, which has been brilliant. I wondered if you could comment on what you think of where Nightline is now, after 50 years.
Okay, I mean, it's still true to its original form. So obviously the format was a good one. The idea was a good one at the beginning. I think the link with the Samaritans originally gave it very much credibility for the university and for all universities, you know, that it was founded and was based on the Samaritan idea. I think that, you know, that's one of the main points that helped its longevity. I mean, it's just one of those points that I think is really important. I mean, I was quite amazed at how much it had grown. A friend of my daughter teaches at a school over here, and one of the fellow teachers had been a Nightline volunteer at Oxford University, and we got talking, and he said, "Oh, you've got to contact them and tell them what you've just told me, you know, about how it started." So you know, and so just finding out a bit more about how it is now, it's quite amazing that how much it has grown. I don't know what else to say, really.
No, I think that really captures it. It's something that we've really appreciated in doing this campaign is how timeless so many elements of what Nightline is and does. And you know, technology may have evolved, but the need for the service has remained unchanged. That maybe the types of calls that people receive might vary over the years, and obviously going through different parts of history will have influenced that. And you know, we're all currently living through a new historical crisis, which will be having impacts, you know, across the board, but particularly on Nightlines and on students. If we think sort of into the future, not that it's really possible to ever predict where we might be. Stirling, first of all, so I'll go to Iona. What's your vision for where you would like to see your Nightline? Say it's 50 years in the future. What's your idea?
I think obviously we're still a very new service, and as the services described from Essex, there's a few more there than we have at the moment. So hopefully over the years we'd be able to develop our service to be able to have some more services as well. That'd be amazing. And I think, yeah, like you said earlier, Katie, about Nightline being timeless. I know I'm graduating this year, but I know of my 4 years this past year being involved in Nightline. I'm going to be able to remember it for the rest of my life and use the skills accordingly as well. And it's amazing actually the number of staff even who I've spoken to about Nightline, and they were involved with Nightline at some point, whether that was as they were a student or whatnot. If Nightline continues to be as impactful for the next 50 years as it has for the past 50 years, then that would be amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just checking briefly with my technical support to see if there's any other questions that some of our viewers might like to ask. Oh, I've just received one. Excellent. This is great being live. So this is from someone watching, and they're interested in the biggest challenge for setting up a nightline. And we've touched upon obviously the reticence from within the university as being one potential challenge. Jen, I wondered if you could comment any further on any challenges that you experienced at Stirling.
Oh gosh, yeah. Oh, I suppose this is kind of like how women feel after they've given birth, and they forget the pain, and they don't, and they think it's like great and everything like that. Because I'm sure past me would say, oh, there's tons of problems, there's tons of issues, but now looking back on it and the fact that we actually did it, I can't really think of anything in particular. But I think one of the biggest challenges that we had, and perhaps this is something that most unis have, because universities are made up of different facets of sort of communities. You've got your faculty, you've got your accommodation, you've got your students, you've got the students' union, all that kind of stuff. Actually, surprisingly and ironically enough, the biggest challenge was to get all of those facets of people to listen to each other and to talk to one another. That was hard. That was difficult because up until Nightline happened, they never really had a reason to talk to one another, which is really strange considering that they all have one thing in common, which is the student body, which is making sure that the education that they're providing to their students is as comprehensive, as encouraging, and as understanding as it can be. That was definitely difficult, and that's something that I think we all need to work on a little bit. We all need to work on listening to one another and listening to the other different groups that are in our university industry and what we can take from one another. Because like Iona said, I had no idea that my professors and lecturers were even part of a nightline at other universities that they had either gone to or lectured in previously. So having that communication there was definitely something that we had to build on. But once we got it, look what we did. We set up a nightline and it launched. So I think, yeah, absolutely, having that communication there and learning how to talk to one another was a challenge, but it was a challenge worth going through for what we got out of it.
Absolutely. Geoffrey, I think you commented early on about the slight the people who were questioning why it would be necessary, why students might need a nightline service. I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about this, maybe where you think that might have been coming from or something.
Well, I think it was partly the publicity people at Essex University were worried about it in 1970, that Essex was going to get a reputation as a university of suicide. You know, it was worried that there would be a suicide epidemic at Essex University. And that wasn't really the case at the time. There was a lot of student unrest, as Marilyn has pointed out, and not particularly good relationships with the authorities at one time. So that was one thing. I think also the opposition came particularly from the social scientists. And social scientists tended to think that student problems should have a proper social setting, that they should be solved in a particular way. And they didn't think that ordinary amateurs, people who are the same as the students with problems and worries and suffering, would be good people to deal with it. Actually, the Samaritans faced the same opposition when the Samaritans started. Chad Varra found, you know, the founder of the Samaritans, found that professionals were all profoundly skeptical to start with, because they thought that they were the right people to deal with student problems, or indeed the problems of anyone. So there was that element as well. As I say, I think that's completely gone now. Samaritans are now accepted among doctors and psychiatrists and so on as an important element in the sort of social fabric. And I think universities now, as far as I know, have the same attitude towards Nightline.
Great, thank you very much. So with that, and with all your contributions, I'd really just like to thank you all for giving up your time this evening. it's been an incredibly valuable conversation for me on a personal level, to hear your stories and your experiences, and I feel hugely privileged to have facilitated this conversation. The Nightline Association is always looking to reconnect with past volunteers, and we are working on an alumni project that's designed to improve these connections between past and present volunteers. And I think this has been a beautiful opportunity to bring some past and present volunteers together. And hopefully people watching will be able to share this far and wide so that we can bring more of our past and present volunteers together. One reason why we're trying to do this is we would like to encourage a sort of buddy scheme where we can match alumni from Nightline with current volunteers so that they can share their experiences, obviously about Nightline, but as well looking into the future for their careers and how we might support one another. And in this vastly virtual world that we're now living in, the possibilities for that have just expanded. And so we're really hoping that more people will engage having watched this. There's numerous ways that anybody can get in touch with the Nightline Association. You can search Nightline alumni on Facebook and LinkedIn and find hundreds and thousands of people that are out there that have been Nightline volunteers. And you can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram to see what we're up to and what we're posting about. Another thing you can do is to get in touch with your university alumni office, who will have details about your existing Nightline. And most Nightlines now as well also have their own website, which is easily searchable, and there'll be ways of you getting in touch if you want to go direct to your existing Nightline. That's another option. I would like to finish by asking Eassa at Essex Nightline if you can tell us how you would summarize what Nightline is. You started really beautifully there with the sales pitch of its students for students, and we've talked about that a lot today. Can you give us a bit of a summary about what Nightline is and how important it is?
So Nightline is again a support service for students by students, mainly providing emotional support during times where, again, like I think when Marilyn was talking about the why it started, it was that there was no other professionals. There's not many services available at night, and I think so. Oh, sorry, I'm getting a bit lost in the point here. So again, yeah. So it's Nightline. I think it's in the name. It's really important that it's open during the night, and that. Sorry, I think I'm just.
I've put you on the spot, which was quite unfair. Yeah. And it was partly because I was transferring it from the technical support who were putting me on the spot as well. So you can be cross with them. But given that you were put on the spot, that was absolutely brilliant. It's, you know, service for students at night. That's simply where it stems from. You know, there isn't an option like that anywhere else. Obviously the Samaritans exist, and it provides a great foundation to the way in which Nightline operates, but it's any volunteer you could speak to with the Samaritans, whereas with Nightlines, you know, it will be a student at the same university that you're at, and that's
that relatability and familiarity, and just I think it just creates a more comfortable setting where people can open up more.
Absolutely. You know, even though it might not be the topic of conversation, that person is, at least in some sense, in a similar situation to you. They can empathize because of that connection. And I think that's really crucial to what the Nightline movement is. And it's the longevity of this movement that we're celebrating and acknowledging today. It's real testament to how important student volunteers are. With the right stakeholder support, obviously, but they're just such a crucial part of the infrastructure of higher education welfare. And today, we recognise the listening legacy that everyone has contributed to that movement. So thank you, everyone who's been on the call with me today. Everything that you've said and the stories that you shared have been incredible. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone else who's been watching and sending in questions. And hopefully if there's other questions that need following up, we'll be able to answer offline at another time. Thank you. Good night.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.